I just want you to know, those of you who are in the education field, I've only been in ministry 15 years. And before that, I was a deacon, I was a Sunday school teacher, I was Sunday school director. So I believe in discipleship as a pastor. And so thank you for those of you who serve in this area of our, very important area of our ministry. And I didn't know how good the speakers were going to be. If I had known that, I would have brought a better talk. But I'll know next time if you have me back. So thanks for allowing me to be here tonight. I did wear a coat, though. I'm the first one so far that wore a coat, so I get a little extra credit there. So one of my first bosses was a summer job that I had. I started working when I was 12 years old. I had a summer job at a concession stand, and it was run by I was in a military town. It was run by a retired sergeant major. And I don't know if you have been around the military very much, but retired sergeant majors, they're kind of dressed right. You know, that's just the way they are. And so we had a lot of them in our town that had these little businesses they started after they retired. And so Mr. Utes was his name, owned this little concession stand. And it was pretty simple. We didn't have a lot of fluff. We had a few things on the menu. We sold Coke and Diet Coke and Sprite in small or large. We had popcorn, small or large. We had coffee, hot dogs, and honey buns. You think you could remember the menu? Pretty soon, right? And it was all spelled out very clearly on the board with what we had and what the prices were. And Mr. Utes had one rule. It was just one. And if you followed this rule, you'll get along fine with Mr. Utes. Mr. Utes' one rule was, if the customer was an idiot, treat them like one, all right? And so you can imagine how it happened almost every day. People constantly, I mean, like every day, people would come up asking for a medium Coke. It's like the most popular size, right? And so they would say a medium Coke. And so the definition of that was a large, charge them for a large, pack it with a lot of ice, and put a little drink on top of it. We call it a snow cone today, but that's how he did it. And you handed it to the customer. If somebody came up and they would say, do you sell hamburgers? He would turn around and he'd say, well, I don't know. Let's read the board together. Let's see. We have hot dogs. I don't see hamburgers. Ron, do you see I don't see hamburgers. And a few times I would hear somebody say something like, I'm going to call the Better Business Bureau on you. To which Mr. Utes would reply, well, good. I've got their number right here. And he would reach under the counter and hand them a business card for the Better Business Bureau. It's true. Just how he did things. A very no-nonsense system. You've probably seen places like that, kind of a soup Nazi kind of Seinfeld kind of place. And when you work at a place like that, it kind of shapes a lot of who you are. You know, I still have some days where I go back to that a little bit. It even impacts my marriage a little bit. I got one of my degrees in Philadelphia, and I fell in love with Philadelphia cheesesteaks. And I know the best places to get them. And so my wife is the sweetest person you'll ever know. I mean, literally, she was texting me just a minute ago. I'm like, baby, I'm about to go on stage, like just a second. But she's texting me, wanting an answer to something. But honey, I'm about to go on. But she's so relational, super sweet. Our church loves her. People line up to give her a hug, that sort of thing. But you don't want her in a cheesesteak place like in Philadelphia with you. You just don't. So because she'll ask questions. And you don't ask questions in places like that. You don't say, do you think I would like that cheese? But they don't know, honey. They're just handing it out. You can't ask questions. So we just have one rule. We go in there, we're not together. I'm not with you, baby. We'll be back together when we get through with this. But I want my cheesesteak, But anyway, Mr. Utes had this very controlled system. Imagine if you led your church that way. And so the most frequent question at our church is, where's the bathroom? And so, well, how bad do you have to go? Hey, what do you have around here for small groups? Well, let's read the bulletin together. Do you want to see if we see what's in here? It wouldn't work in the church world, would it? And yet, unfortunately, a lot of ministry leaders and, frankly, churches are that way. Not that we're rude. I mean, although I've been in a few churches, I preached one time at a church, and literally no one spoke to me until I stepped up on even then, when I stepped up on the podium. No one. I mean, I didn't even say hello. It was like, we aren't always the most welcoming, but a lot of our churches are very tightly controlled system. When we got to our church, wonderful church, over 100 years old, had seen better times, but it was great people. Please don't hear me saying they're not wonderful people. They are. But it was, we had a rule for everything. I mean, we had a policy voted on by the church for folding chairs. Like what happens if somebody borrows them and how do if you've got a folding chair policy, you probably have too many policies. I'm just saying. If your policy manual has the word diarrhea in it, voted on by the church, it's probably too thick. I'm just saying. We had about 45 committees. I was supposed to serve on all of them. And out of those committees, you had to be there a year before you could serve on one of the committees. And one of our committees was the garden committee. And I just always like to ask, how long do you have to be saved before you can pull weeds? I don't know. And I'm not trying to be funny, but as a church, we can be very controlling of our ministries. My topic is give your ministry away, and I've only been given 30 minutes. I normally in a conference talk for 45 minutes, but I'm a Baptist preacher, and brunch is always stronger than the altar call, so I can move quickly, right? But there's a few key reasons people refuse to give their ministry away, or delegate, as we might say it a more common word. And we see them in the Bible, which I still believe. I talk about a lot of leadership principles, but I still believe the Bible is the best leadership book we can find. But I'll take them in pairs of reasons we don't give our ministry away. The first two are pride and selfishness. Pride and selfishness. Pride, we don't want anyone else to get the credit, and selfishness, we don't want anyone else to get the credit, right? Or pride, we don't think anyone else can do it as well as we can. You may recall God had not wanted the Israelites to have a king. And of course, the people grumbled. Every other nation has a king. We don't have a king. There's been grumblers around. It's not just your church. They've been around a long time. So God gave them a king. And when God gave them a king, he gave them a good one, at least in appearance. 1 Samuel chapter 9, verse 2 says, he had a son named Saul, an impressive young man. There was no one more impressive among the Israelites than he. He stood a head taller than anyone else. King Saul was exactly what they wanted. He was a king's king, a man's man kind of guy, handsome, strong, and determined. And Saul had the opportunity to rule God's people, to call upon God for strength. God had given him that ability. God had blessed Saul's life. He had promised him victory if he'd only obey. And after one of the more familiar stories of the Bible, David and Goliath, of course, David became a local hero. It didn't set too well with Saul. Consider Saul's reaction in 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 5. David marched out with the army and was successful in everything Saul sent him to do. Saul put him in command of the fighting men, which pleased all the people and Saul's servants as well. As the troops were coming back when David was returning from killing the Philistine, the women came out from all the cities of Israel to meet King Saul, singing and dancing with tambourines, with shouts of joy, and with 3-stringed instruments. As they danced, the women sang, Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. Saul was furious and resented this song. They credited tens of thousands to David, he complained, but they only credited me with thousands. What more can he have but the kingdom? So Saul watched David jealously from that day forward. Here's a king who had everything going for him. He had the power, he had the prestige, he had the pleasure, he had the position. Of course, at this time, Saul had already lost the blessings of God of his kingship. David had already been anointed to take his place. Saul was still acting as king, but it wasn't enough for him. Saul's focus became obsessed with David. If you recall, Saul even offered his daughters in marriage to David as a bribe to get David to go to war, hoping he'd be killed on the battlefield. When David was successful at every battle, Saul set out to kill him on his own. Tragic. A man so prepared to be king, but with everything you'd want to be king, in a king. But as I study Saul and I I like to study, because I like to study leadership, I like to study the leadership tendencies of people in the Bible. And as I study Saul, based on what I know about leaders and what I know about people, Saul had a problem. And if you know the story at all, it was this character flaw that ultimately led to him losing it all. We might say he kind of let the job go to his head. Do you ever know anybody like that? Saul's problem was actually an addiction problem. Saul liked attention. He relished the position. It's a reason leaders fall even today. In fact, there may be someone here today and you're struggling with that addiction right here in this room. Even the person talking to you can struggle with this addiction at times. It affects the cars we drive, the houses we live in. It impacts where we go on vacation. It impacts, some of us will go into huge debt because of this addiction. Saul loved power, and he loved the way people responded to his power. He liked the way heads turned when he walked in the room. And just like Saul, many leaders have the addiction too. It's an addiction to being liked. Isn't it the whole premise behind the social media craze? Our culture suffers from an addiction to the approval of others. And leaders with this addiction might be heard saying something or silently thinking, I need to know about everything happening around here. Or if I don't do it, it won't be done right. Or if I left, all this would fall apart. Or they might say, you know, those people need me. Sadly, their attempt to perpetuate the perception of superiority causes them to ignore the wisdom of other people or the input of people on their team. And those of us in the sin-fighting business know there's always a root cause for actions like Saul's. It's a bigger, deeper issue. I'm convinced pride and selfishness are the root cause of Saul's demise. The other reasons we don't give away our ministry, we don't delegate, is ignorance or fear. Ignorance, we just don't know any better. Or fear, we're afraid to let go. Moses certainly took on a lot of responsibility for himself. In the book, Overcoming the Dark Side of Leadership, and I would recommend that book, Gary McIntosh describes Moses as a compulsive leader. Sadly, I took the quiz in the back of the book, and that's my default also. But he writes about Moses. Moses felt a need to have control and believed that he alone was capable of doing the job correctly. In Exodus 18, we are told that Moses alone would mediate disputes among the people and render authoritative arguments. In order to accomplish this task, the people with disputes would stand around Moses from morning until evening, a period at least 12 hours, so that Moses could settle their problems. Apparently, some of these disputes were quite petty in nature. And McIntosh estimates that Moses had 3 million people under his leadership. Moses, to me, appears to have suffered from one or both of either ignorance, he just didn't know any better, or fear. And fear actually stemming, I would say, from guilt. I wonder if Moses almost felt the need to pay back God. You remember Moses was a murderer, right? Never convicted, but widely known. McIntosh also writes about pastors struggling with this compulsion or control syndrome. He said there are many pastors and spiritual leaders today who feel they need to be in complete control of their organization in every minute detail. They must oversee the preparation of the bulletin to ensure it meets their high standards. They pick every song for Sunday worship. There's a worship director, but that person cannot match the song perfectly to the theme of the sermon. These leaders are obsessive over every decision. One pastor of a large church insisted that his staff wear black or blue suits, white shirts, and red ties. That was staff policy. It wasn't me. It wasn't me, I promise. I just say you can't wear suits. That's my policy, right? But there are a myriad of other reasons we don't give away our ministries. But how do we avoid it? How do we avoid becoming control-oriented people? How do we become people who are willing to actually give our visions away? I want to share a few thoughts, actually 4. The first one is this. You have to follow and learn from good leaders. You have to follow and learn from good leaders. The best leaders I know naturally give their ministry away. They don't control everything. They realize that it will be limited if they try to, and so they give it away. So many stories of David's leadership. For the sake of time, I'm not going to read them. I'm going to give you some homework to go read some of them. My favorite are in 1 Samuel chapter 23, verses 1 through 5, and 2 Samuel chapter 23. And it's amazing to see before David was anointed and then appointed king, and then after, towards the end of his ministry, he's the same leader. You see, leadership is about making a difference in the lives of other people. It's influencing people towards a greater reality than they know today. And ultimately, as godly leaders, it's about taking people to places God has seen, but only our faith can imagine. Godly leaders serve not for their own will, but for the glory of God. And so therefore, recognizing that, God-fearing leaders always remain humble. They know it's not about them. And I see that so well in the life of David. Remember, David had no position before when he slayed Goliath. He was just doing what he felt like God was calling him to do. But no doubt he was very much the leader on the battlefield that day. And yet, even when he had the opportunity to kill Saul, he didn't take it. No wonder David was a man after God's own heart. Not perfect. Whenever I talk about David's leadership, somebody always brings up his sin, right? You know? Let he who without sin raise your hand, right? I love this verse about after David's major failure. This is after David is gone. Nevertheless, for David's sake, the Lord his God gave him a lamp in Jerusalem by raising up a son to succeed him and by making Jerusalem strong. For David had done what was right in the eyes of the Lord and had not failed to keep any of the Lord's commands all the days of his life. Except in the case of Uriah the Hittite. 1 Kings chapter 15. Yeah, he wasn't a perfect guy. And this may be a word somebody in here needs to hear. You come to a conference like this and you want a little encouragement, just a little boost. So I'm not sure who needs this, but you may have bad seasons in leadership, but your heart disqualifies you more than your actions ever will. So if it's a bad season right now, push through it and get to a better season. But of course, Jesus is our best example of giving ministry away. Mark 6:7 says he called his 12 disciples together and began sending them out 2 by 2, giving them authority to cast out evil spirits. Luke 10, verse 1, the Lord now chose 72 other disciples and sent them ahead in pairs at all towns and places he planned to visit. And of course, Jesus has entrusted his leadership of the church to the people in this room. Now that ought to astound you. It does me that he would trust me. I know I'm not qualified. I tell our church all the time. I mean, there's nothing except the grace of God that allows me to stand up here in front of you. Nothing. I've never done anything worthy of that. And if you think you have, you haven't. And yet Jesus is our best example of giving ministry away. We need to follow that lead. So we need to follow better leaders. But the second thing to help us do that is you got to love people more than you love yourself. Now that makes sense, right? Because that's what the Bible says, right? You got to love people more than you love yourself. One of the hard parts of saying you heard me last year is I only have about 4 stories, Bob, so you get to hear some of the same stories over again. But I years ago, I was new into ministry, and we really wanted to plant churches, and we just really sensed God wanted us to plant lots of churches, and so we I had a heart for New York City, and part of the reason I had a heart for New York is that I had read where the churches were moving out of the city and the people were moving into the city, and we were losing it. You know, we're very involved in Chicago now, but the churches it was not happening. We have so many lost people. I'm going to share tonight at this Sunday school thing about some cultural changes that have happened and some solutions to address some of those cultural things. But we have masses of people who have no concept of the gospel, and a lot of them are in our cities. And so I just really felt like that was something maybe we were supposed to do. And so we went to New York, my wife and I, and we love the city. And it's funny because I'd promised her we'd dance while we were in the city. Do you know how hard it is for a Baptist pastor to find a place to dance in New York City? And so we literally just had to go back to our room, turn on the radio, and dance. You know, it was the only thing we could do. But we went to the city, and we're exploring. And I like to get up early and get out and run or walk the city. And so I just was out. And please understand, I'm Baptist too. All right. So don't get too upset if I tell you God has spoken to me before, all right? And I didn't have my Bible in front of me. It was just like God spoke to me, okay? It hadn't happened many times, but it has happened, all right? And I raised my hand when I worship too, so sorry about that. But we were in New York, and I was walking one morning and just talking to God, and I said, God, if this is the place you want us to come, if you want us to come to New York, then you got to give me a heart for these people that's overwhelming, that's undeniable, that I can't escape. And it was almost instant. God said, Ron, and don't you love He knows your name? Isn't that wonderful? He said, Ron, you're asking me to do the wrong thing. Okay, what do I need to ask? And I sense God say, Ron, you need to ask me to give you a heart for me that's overwhelming, that's undeniable, that you cannot escape. Because if you have that kind of heart for me, wherever you go, you're going to love the people. And that changed me because it freed me from New York. I didn't have to go to New York. I could go to Lexington, Kentucky among some of the, wait, this is being recorded, isn't it? You know, I could be among some people who are not very nice sometimes in the established church. And I could still love them as long as I'm loving Him first. And we have this one man, and I always try to find this one man or one person, she's usually been a man, who is the meanest person I've ever met. Do you have any of those? And I mean, there are some weeks I'd get 4 or 5 emails from him. I don't know if he's ever liked anything. I mean, he's just mean. One day I asked him, why are you so mean? I mean, I didn't ask it in quite that way, but pretty much that's what I said. And he told me this story. He had been hurt 20 years ago or so in the church. That's a long time to hold on to pain, isn't it? But as I began to love him, because I'm loving God first, it began to change the way I viewed him. It began to change the way he views me. I only get 1 email a week now. And here's why this matters. I'm not trying to give ministry to him by any means. I've actually prayed a few prayers for him that come from the Psalms. Start with Psalm 35. You can look it up later. And I'm kidding, but the reason that's so important is he's kind of become my standard. Am I loving him? Who's that one person in your church that if you're not loving them, you're really not loving your people? Even when you get the all cap emails, right? And I realize everybody in here loves their people, or you wouldn't be doing what you're doing. But do you love them enough to trust them with your ministry? You see, you'll never give away your ministry until you surround yourself with people you trust enough to take your vision and implement it the way they're going to do with their own personal touch. And the more you love people, the more you'll trust people. Here's the deal. When you give your ministry away, you'll have less. It will feel empty for a little while, but you'll actually feel like you have more. You have less power, but you gain more influence. You have less responsibility, but you have more impact. Love people enough to give away your ministry. And then the third thing I would say, make it a life goal to become a builder of dreams. Make it your life goal to become a builder of dreams, other people's dreams, not your own. When you're a builder of dreams, you're a builder of people. Isn't that what Christ has called us to do? When you change the why behind, and it's funny, I already had this in my notes, but when you change the why behind the what, you'll be more motivated. And here's the cool thing too. At the end of the day, you're going to find more joy in building successful people than building a successful name for yourself. Make it a goal that when people leave your leadership, whether that's a Sunday school leadership or the church or whatever ministry you lead, make it your goal that when they leave you, they're going to be better prepared for whatever they're going on to next. Every time you invest in someone personally, you're sending a message to people about your leadership, about the church, about the ministry that you lead. I look back over my life and I think about people who were a huge influence on me. A pastor who said one day, here's a crazy thing. I've only been to Oklahoma City a few times. One of those times was to hang out with a pastor who had a huge investment in me. He was pastor right up the street here till recently at Henderson Hills. Some of you know that church. And Dennis Newkirk was my pastor for just a short time. But he pulled me aside one day. I was leading in the world. I was in my 20s, but I was already leading in business and in the community. And he pulled me aside one day. I'd been in church all my life, but I'd never done anything in the church. And he said, Ron, you have the potential to be a giant killer. You need to kill some giants for the kingdom of God. I grew up without a father. Anybody else grow up without a father? Anybody have anybody in their church that grew up without a father? I'm going to tell you, a word like that set me on fire. I wouldn't be in ministry today had he not pulled me aside, said a few simple words to me. A teacher who pulled me aside when I was in the 6th grade, I was going to the 7th grade, and she pulled me aside and she said, Ron, the friends you're hanging out with right now, if you keep hanging out with them, you're going to end up where they're going to go, and that's not where you want to end up. It was a huge word for me. I rearranged my set of friends, and I'm friends with some of them on Facebook now. I don't want to be where they're at. It changed who I am. A high school principal had told me, I was student body president, and he said, this is such a huge word. People ask all the time, how do you become humbled? You become humbled because you're humbled. You become humble because you're humbled. That's just the reality. When you grow up without a father and you go to church and everybody else has a dad, you're humbled. But I was a student body president, and every time we would do something wrong, I would take personal. It would just kill me. I would just like, oh, it's all my fault. And he pulled me aside. He was a retired colonel, by the way, so I've been surrounded by military all my life. But he said, Ron, I appreciate your humility, but don't trip over your own humility. If God sends you somewhere, he was a Christian, if God sends you somewhere, he asks you to do something, do it to the best of your ability. Don't trip over your own humility. That was huge for me. I would not be standing here because I don't like attention. I'm an introvert. But I wouldn't be standing here had I not had that word. It reminds me our words have great value. Is there any wonder why James talks about the power of the tongue? And you can't add greater value to someone than when you trust them enough to give your ministry to them and tell them to run with it. And fourth and finally, you've got to keep a tight rein on your heart. You got to keep a tight rein on your heart. You got to protect your heart when you begin to give ministry away. Proverbs 4:23 says, guard your heart above all else, for it determines the course of your life. David's son wrote that. And I wonder had he learned it firsthand watching his father. There'll always be a tendency when you give ministry away, there'll always be a tendency to want to take it back. It's that natural pride, that natural selfishness, that natural fear, that natural ignorance, whatever it is going to creep back in. Oh, they're getting credit now, or they're not doing it the way I want to do it, or they're not talking about me now. So there's going to be this tendency to try to draw it back in, take control again, get credit again. We saw that in Saul. Don't give in to it. Protect your heart. My son joined us last August as teaching pastor, and he is so incredibly gifted. It's just amazing how God has gifted him. He's 26. We're trying to marry him off. We've already got the girl. We've told him, but he's so incredibly talented, and he's been preaching literally since he was 3 years old in our backyard, standing on a tree stump for any of the neighborhood kids who would show up. It's so cool. But I'm happy for him. I mean, he's great, but I'm going to be honest, I feel like Saul sometimes when people brag on him. We hired the wrong preacher. I hear that almost every week. When's Nate preaching again? And I'm from Kentucky, so they talk like that, all right? One guy came up to me after the Easter service. I just preached the Easter service. And he came up to, we were both standing there, and he said, "We know why we brought Nate in. Just to show your dad what an awful preacher he is." Thanks a lot, right? I mean, I felt like they were singing a song. Ron has preached his thousands. Nate has preached his tens of thousands, right? And I'm joking, of course. Of course, my heart is for my son. I want him to succeed. But I have to guard my heart there too. On the plane, there's a safety speech, the one you never listen to if you fly very often, but there's actually a very important life and leadership principle in that speech. Listen to part of it. It says, if cabin pressure should change, panels above your seat will open, revealing oxygen masks. Reach up and pull a mask towards you. Place it over your nose and mouth and secure with an elastic band that can be adjusted to ensure a snug fit. The plastic bag will not fully inflate, although oxygen is flowing. And then listen to this. Secure your own mask before helping others. This week, I encourage you to examine your heart. Would you ask yourself some hard questions? What's fueling your sense of self-worth? Where are you finding your greatest satisfaction in life these days? How do you feel about yourself based on when you compare yourself to other people? What are you doing these days that when you take a real hard look, you're only doing it because you want people to like you? Are you living for the approval of others? Or the approval of you? Or are you living for the approval of God? Because only one will truly satisfy. And finally, what are you currently doing that you need to give away? For the good of others, for the good of your church, and for the good of your heart. Will you pray with me? God, thank you for these leaders. And I don't know all their stories, but just like a church, there's some that are sitting here and they're in very good seasons. There's others who are in tough seasons. Some are here just to escape a little while. God, would you just encourage everyone in this room, regardless of where they're at? God, we are not perfect people, and we're not in perfect churches, none of us. But there's not one person in this room that doesn't desire to serve you well. And so, God, help us this week to do better at expanding the kingdom by giving our ministry away. We love you so much. In Jesus' name, amen.